Welcome. This Advanced King's Indian lesson studies the classical variation with 9 knight e1. We begin with the original Mar Dal Plata attack, watch white's defensive method evolve, and finish with the current knight d3, bishop e3, a4, and rook c1 theory. d4. White controls e5 and c5 and prepares a broad pawn center. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and keeps both central pawn breaks available. c4. White controls d5 and creates the pawn that may later advance to c5. g6. Black prepares the dark squared bishop for the long diagonal. Knight c3. White develops and prepares to occupy the center with e4. Bishop g7. The bishop waits for the center to open and pressures the long diagonal. e4. White builds the full pawn center and accepts a future attack on e4. d6. Black controls e5 and prepares the central strike with e5. Knight f3. White supports e5 and d4 and prepares to castle. Castles. Black secures the king before challenging white's center. Bishop e2. White chooses the main classical setup and keeps the king side compact. e5. Black attacks d4 and invites white to close the position. Castles. White completes king safety before fixing the pawn chains. Knight c6. Black adds pressure to d4 and forces white to decide the center. d5. White gains space and locks the pawn chains toward opposite wings. Knight e7. Black clears c6 and prepares to move the f6 knight through d7. Knight e1. White clears f3 for the f-pawn and plans to return the knight through d3. White wants f3, knight d3, c5, and b4. Black wants knight d7, f5, f4, and g5. The names in databases vary, but the tournament position is unmistakable. This is the classical 9 knight e1 Mar Dal Plata main line. Knight d7. Black supports f5 and adds control over c5. Knight d3. White improves the displaced knight and supports c5 and b4. f5. Black challenges e4 before white can open the queen side. f3. White reinforces e4 and prepares a light square shell around the king. f4. Black clamps f3 and gains space for the g-pawn advance. Bishop d2. White develops without blocking the c-file and prepares rook c1. Knight f6. Black reactivates the knight and prepares g5 without abandoning e4. b4. White prepares c5 and b5 before black's attack becomes forcing. g5. Black supports f4 and prepares to drive the g-pawn toward white's king. c5. White attacks d6 and gains the c4 square for a piece. h5. Black adds another pawn to the attack and keeps the g-pawn protected after g4. Knight f2. White guards h3 and prepares to meet g4 with greater control. Knight g6. Black points the knight toward h4 and f4 while supporting g5. Rook c1. White places the rook behind the c-pawn and prepares exchanges on d6. Rook f7. Black protects c7 laterally and prepares rook g7 behind the g-pawn. C takes d6. White removes black's central anchor and forces the c-pawn away from c7. C takes d6. Black keeps the center closed and opens c7 for the queen or rook. a4. White prepares a5 and fixes a queenside target. Bishop f8. Black covers g7 and queenside entry squares while clearing g7 for the rook. a5. White gains a protected space wedge and prepares knight b5. Rook g7. Black aligns the rook with the g-pawn and the white king. h3. White controls g4 and gives the king a dark square escape route. Knight h8. Black sends the knight toward f7 or g6 without blocking the rook. Knight b5. White attacks d6 and c7, but black's kingside forces are already coordinated. g4. Black finally opens lines because the rook, bishop, and knights are ready behind the pawns. Najdorf vs. Gligoric at Mar del Plata in 1953 established black's complete attacking mechanism. The crucial ideas were rook f7 to g7, bishop f8, and patient piece improvement before g4. The lesson is not to push faster, it is to make every attacking pawn break arrive with pieces behind it. Rewind to the position after 9 knight e1. First examine the flexible knight e8 move order, which keeps d7 free and delays black's exact attacking structure. Knight e8. Black supports f5 while keeping the queenside knight free from c5 duties. Bishop e3. White clears c1 and keeps f3 ready for the next move. f5. Black begins the standard break while the knight remains flexible on e8. f3. White protects e4 and prepares a queenside expansion. King h8. Black steps off the diagonal and waits to see whether white chooses a4 or c5. a4. White prepares a5 and prevents black from gaining space with a5 under ideal conditions. Knight g8. Black plans knight f6 without blocking the d-file or committing the other knight. a5. White secures space, while black retains a compact position and delayed kingside play. Return to the position after 9 knight e1. Black can also restrain the queenside immediately with a5 before choosing the knight route. a5. Black makes b4 harder and creates a queenside square for the rook. Knight d3. White continues development and keeps c5 as the main break. Knight e8. Black prepares f5 without blocking the queenside knight. f3. White protects the center before expanding on either wing. f5. Black challenges e4 now that b4 has been slowed. g4. White prevents a clean f4 advance, but fixes new kingside targets. Return once more to the position after 9 knight e1. The immediate c5 changes the nature of the struggle by blocking white's own c-pawn. c5. Black prevents white's thematic c5 break and accepts a permanent d5 space wedge. a3. White supports b4 and keeps the a-file available after exchanges. Knight e8. Black begins the usual kingside plan from a closed queenside. b4. White attacks the c5 chain and tries to open the b-file. b6. Black reinforces c5 and makes white decide whether to exchange. Rook b1. White supports b takes c5 and keeps the a-pawn free. f5. Black attacks e4 while white's queenside remains partially closed. f3. White secures e4 and enters a slower maneuvering game rather than a pure race. Return to the position after 9 knight e1. Knight d7 remains the theoretical main reply because it supports f5 and restrains c5 at the same time. Knight d7. Black supports f5 and makes white reveal the preferred setup. f3. White secures e4 immediately but delays the e1 knight's return. f5. Black challenges e4 before white completes queenside development. g4. White blocks f4 and claims kingside space, but fixes pawns in front of the king. f takes g4. Black exchanges the front pawn to create lines and a target on g4. f takes g4. White keeps e4 protected and gains space, while the f-file becomes half open. Knight f6. Black attacks g4 and e4 while preparing a later h5. h3. White protects g4 and creates a shelter square for the king. h5. Black attacks g4 again and may open the h-file after exchanges. The old g4 wall can hold, but white has committed 3 kingside pawns before the e1 knight returns. Modern white usually develops with knight d3 or bishop e3 first, preserving the choice between a queenside race and a kingside blockade. Return to white's 10th move. Knight d3 develops immediately and leaves bishop e3, bishop d2, and f3 available in several orders. Knight d3. White supports c5 and b4 while restoring the knight to the game. f5. Black begins the normal break before white completes the queenside. Bishop d2. White clears c1 for the rook and prepares a direct c5 break. Knight f6. Black supports e4 pressure and prepares to advance the f-pawn. f3. White builds the center before opening the queenside. f4. Black fixes f3 and prepares g5. c5. White attacks d6 before black's g-pawn arrives. g5. Black ignores the queenside and builds the direct attack. Rook c1. White prepares c takes d6 and pressure along the open file. Knight g6. Black supports h4 and joins the attack before opening files. Return to the position after 10 f5. Modern black often restrains the queenside before fixing the kingside structure. f3. White protects e4 without choosing the bishop's final square. a5. Black takes a useful restraining tempo before the kingside becomes forcing. Bishop e3. White clears c1 and supports the dark squares around the king. b6. Black supports c5 control and prepares bishop a6 without closing the center. a3. White supports b4 and keeps the a-file structure flexible. Bishop a6. Black eyes c4 and d3 and makes b4 harder to execute cleanly. b3. White protects c4 and prepares a slower queenside expansion. Knight f6. Black now resumes the attack from a queenside position that is harder to open. Return to white's 10th move. Bishop e3 is the sharpest theoretical test because white develops before f3 and reserves knight d3 for the right moment. Bishop e3. White clears c1 and prepares bishop f2 once the f-pawn advances. f5. Black attacks e4 before white opens the queenside. f3. White supports e4 and creates a retreat square for the bishop on f2. Knight f6. Black increases pressure on e4 and waits before fixing the kingside pawns. Knight d3. White reinforces e5 and prepares c5 without weakening the king further. f4. Black fixes f3 after white has improved the knight. Bishop f2. White protects g3 and keeps the bishop outside the pawn chain. Rewind to the position after 11 f3. The direct f4 remains the theoretical backbone because it fixes white's structure immediately. f4. Black gains space, restricts the e2 bishop, and prepares g5. Bishop f2. White guards g3 and h4 while leaving c1 for the rook. g5. Black supports f4 and prepares g4 against the king. First examine b4. White gains space but gives black time to improve every attacking piece. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and prepares knight g6. c5. White attacks d6 and starts the race immediately. Knight g6. Black supports h4 and keeps the g-pawn ready to advance. C takes d6. White opens the c-file and tries to exploit c7. C takes d6. Black preserves the central lock and opens c7 for defense. Rook c1. White pressures c7 and prepares a queenside invasion. Rook f7. Black guards c7 and prepares kingside support. a4. White prepares a5 and knight b5. Bishop f8. Black reinforces g7 and the queenside dark squares. a5. White restricts b6 and creates the b5 outpost. Bishop d7. Black protects b5 and coordinates the rooks. Knight b5. White threatens to invade c7 and a7. g4. Black opens the king before answering the queenside threat. Knight c7. White attacks a8 and wins material if black cannot force the king. Pause the video. White is ready to take the rook on a8. Find the pawn move that values open lines around the king above material on the queen side. g3. Black attacks h2, opens the g-file, and creates knight h5 to g3 with check. Knight takes a8. White wins the exchange, but the knight is far from the king. Knight h5. Black threatens g takes f2 and knight g3 check. King h1. White avoids an immediate check but cannot close the files. G takes f2. Black captures the bishop that guarded the light squares. Rook takes f2. White restores material around the king but exposes the second rank. Knight g3 check. Black coordinates queen, rook, and knight against the exposed king. King g1. White steps away, but the a8 knight remains trapped. Queen takes a8. Black restores material with the safer king and continuing initiative. Return to the position after 12 g5. Piquet's improvement was rook c1, preparing to sacrifice the c-pawn for time and open files instead of advancing b4 first. Rook c1. White supports c5 and prepares to use the c-file even if the pawn disappears. Knight g6. Black joins the kingside pressure and waits for c5. c5. White attacks d6 and offers black a pawn that will cost several knight tempi. Pause the video. Black can close with a queenside pawn move or accept on c5. Decide whether the c-pawn is genuinely poisoned, and identify the knight's safe retreat route after b4. Knight takes c5. Black accepts because the knight has a prepared route through a6. b4. White drives the knight and opens the b-file while the c-file is already active. Knight a6. Black keeps the extra pawn and prepares bishop d7 and b6. Knight d3. White supports b4 and prepares knight b5. h5. Black supports g4 while white's queenside tempi are still being converted. Knight b5. White attacks d6 and c7 and may exchange a key defender. Bishop d7. Black covers b5 entry squares and prepares to challenge the knight. a4. White prepares a5 and makes the a6 knight uncomfortable. Rook f7. Black protects c7 laterally and supports the kingside pawns. Rook c3. White protects the third rank and may swing to g3 while attacking the queenside. b6. Black gives the a6 knight routes and limits white's queenside pieces. Bishop e1. White guards h4 and g3 while keeping queenside pressure. Return to the position after 12 g5. The modern positional move is a4, fixing a queenside hook before white commits the c-pawn or b-pawn. a4. White prepares a5 and prevents black from gaining the same space under ideal conditions. First examine a5. Black fixes the queenside and makes b4 the only direct pawn break. Knight d3. White supports b4 and keeps the c-pawn flexible. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and prepares g4 with better coordination. b4. White opens queenside contact despite the fixed a-pawn. A takes b4. Black removes the pawn and creates an a-file target. Knight takes b4. White restores the pawn and places the knight on an active queenside square. Return to the position after 13 a4. Knight f6 develops first and waits to see whether white chooses a5 or c5. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and preserves the option of knight g6 later. a5. White fixes b6 and prepares c5 and knight b5. Knight g6. Black reinforces h4 and makes g4 a concrete threat. c5. White attacks d6 before black can open the king. Rook f7. Black protects the queenside laterally and prepares support for g4. C takes d6. White opens the c-file and fixes a target on d6. C takes d6. Black restores a closed center and opens c7 for defense. Knight b5. White attacks d6 and c7 and eyes a7. g4. Black values open lines over queenside material and forces white to calculate. Knight takes a7. White wins a pawn and attacks c8, but the knight is far from the king. Bishop d7. Black connects the queenside defense and threatens to trap the invading knight. Return again to 13 a4. Knight g6 is the direct alternative, keeping maximum kingside pressure while allowing white's a-pawn to advance. Knight g6. Black prepares h5 and g4 without spending a tempo on f6. a5. White fixes b6 and secures the b5 outpost. King h8. Black leaves the g-file clear and prepares to open lines without a diagonal check. b4. White prepares c5 and b5 while the a-pawn holds its clamp. Rook g8. Black places the rook directly behind the g-pawn and intensifies the attack. c5. White attacks d6 and tries to open the queenside before g4 lands. Knight f6. Black supports g4 and e4 while keeping the other knight on g6. C takes d6. White removes the anchor and opens the c-file. C takes d6. Black keeps the diagonal closed and trusts the kingside pressure. Rook c1. White targets c7 and supports a future knight invasion. Bishop h6. Black clears g7 for the rook and attacks the e3 bishop's defender. h3. White controls g4 and gives the king a defensive resource. Pause and choose black's plan after 13 a4. Play a5 when stopping white's clamp matters most. Play knight f6 when you want maximum flexibility. Play knight g6 when you accept the queenside space in exchange for immediate kingside pressure. The correct choice is a plan, not a memorized label. The classical 9-knight e1 line rewards coordination over speed. Gligoric showed black how rook f7, bishop f8, and a patient knight route make g4 powerful. Korchnoi and Piquet showed white how a4, c5, rook c1, and a c-pawn investment can slow the attack. For tournament play, white should know knight d3, bishop e3, 13 a4, and 13 rook c1. Black should know when to restrain with a5, when to develop with knight f6, and when direct knight g6 pressure is justified.